Hey everyone, and welcome back to World History. Today we're going to talk about this era of piety, as I describe it, that sweeps through China, the Middle East, and Europe, and culminates in the Crusades, especially in the western part of Eurasia. We'll begin with China. So as you recall, China has been dealing with what exactly they want to do with the Turks. And there's a big Turkish population in China. The Uyghurs still in modern China are one example of the Turkic groups there. But after the fall of the Tang Dynasty, people blame the Turks for everything that's been going wrong in China. And the dynasty that takes over, the Song Dynasty, takes a very xenophobic approach to government. They spend most of their time and money trying to defend their borders and trying to create a pure version of Chinese culture that finds its expression in a movement called Neo-Confucianism. This focuses particularly on the morality, the rationality, and the responsibility of the people in China. So, for example, in the rational sense, for the first time in Chinese history, they take the Yi Jing out of the examinations that they have for civil service. You might remember reading the Yi Jing or reading about it all the way back when we talked about the Zhou dynasty. They also remove all Buddhism from the civil service exam. That had been added under the Tang dynasty, especially by their empress Wu Zetian. Despite the fact that the Song dynasty is defined by these reactionary measures, they actually do have a lot of very important achievements. Probably the most important achievement in the Song dynasty is the use of coal. The Song ruled over China in an era of huge population expansion, and coal was necessary because they needed wood to use for building. So coal became their fuel source of choice. They also introduced the world to gunpowder, printed money, and movable printing. So these are all very important achievements that slowly filter their way into Europe through mostly Arab intermediaries. Meanwhile, in Europe, we have Christianity moving in kind of two different directions. First, the church as an organization is centralizing around the Pope. And second, Christians themselves, the individual worshipers, want a more personal connection to their religion. So they don't want a distant relationship to their priest, they want a very close relationship with the text and the God himself. So here you see Notre Dame de Paris after the fire. But what happens is more and more money ends up in the church, and we see huge acts of devotion like the building of Gothic cathedrals. And this is the western facade, which was finished in the late 1200s. Those are actually individual acts of worship done by communities, not led by the papacy. But the papacy is having a big moment at the time. They won a big fight against kings of Europe over who gets to control the bishops, who gets to appoint bishops and tell them what to do. Bishops actually control a lot of land, and they're often military leaders too. So being the person who appoints bishops is very important in Europe at this time. The popes also begin to create laws, particularly laws about who can marry, which has a big influence on how dynasties run and how the different lords of Europe interact with each other. Those laws are still in force today. If you have a Catholic marriage, you actually have to sign agreements that were first written in the 1200s. And then finally, the papacy has a very important role in Europe for mediating disputes between rulers. Basically, whenever two kings have a fight with each other, the Pope is often called upon to mediate between them. This becomes especially important after the Viking invasions of the 900s because the Vikings are a new force in Europe, and the Pope can kind of present himself as a neutral territory between the Vikings and the earlier leaders that the Vikings take over. And this becomes especially important because the Pope becomes the mediator for what's called the Truce of God, this movement in the church to promote peace among the different peoples of Europe and to stop all the fighting that began with Viking raids. On the other side, you have growing piety, and here, as a symbol of that, I have a confessional booth. People wanted to have a close personal relationship with God, and they also feared being a sinner. Confession was a way in which the church created a middle ground where people could have their personal behaviors forgiven by their priest to ensure that they'll have a nice afterlife. This begins with the foundation of more churches. Cathedrals are a good example of this because they're churches that are founded by local communities, but you also have really small churches throughout the European countryside. Some historians have even called this a form of colonization, of Christianity colonizing the European interior. The other big sign of this growing piety are groups of monks called friars. Unlike more traditional monks, friars do not cloister themselves up in monasteries. Instead, their job is to go out into the city preaching and doing good works for people. They are meeting this need for a personal connection by going out and preaching to interested people. And then finally, you have the growth of kind of fanatical religious practices. We're really going to see them come to fruition in the 1300s, but you already have radical acts of violence against homosexuals, against Jewish people, even in the early Middle Ages, especially around the year 1000 when the millennium turns. People begin kind of going towards apocalyptic preaching. Kind of like the Y1K of the medieval world. In Islam, you have similar movements that are pulling people into more individual forms of devotion. The big movement in Islam are the arrival of Turkish invaders. So we talked about Turks in China already, beginning even with the fall of the Han Dynasty. Well, now Turks have moved west into the Islamic world, and they begin to take over parts of it. For example, the Abbasid Caliphate al-Mamun hired a group of Turks called the Mamluks to be his personal army. Well, they weren't too fond of him, and they ended up taking control of the caliphate and splitting it in half between them. In the early 1000s, you have another group of Turks called the Seljuk Turks, who sweep through the Islamic world and take over much of it. As a matter of fact, the Crusades are actually called as a war against the Seljuk Turks, not as a war against Islam as a religion or a philosophy. The big impact of the dissolution of the caliphates is that nobody's around that can regulate the belief of Muslims anymore. Turks especially, they're one of those nomadic horse people that don't really care too much about the intricacies of religion. As a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons why Arabs and the people of the caliphates aren't too fond of the Turks themselves. In the meantime, a religious movement called Sufism is emerging as well, where people, Sufis are individual leaders who do not have one school of thought. They are not a particular branch of Islam. Instead, it's the idea that individual charismatic leaders can have a role in the worship of Allah, and that individual followers of them have an important role in the worship of Allah. And you see that depicted here. Then the final big movement that's happening is the arrival of a group called the Assassins. These are a radical political group that are trying to refound the caliphate. Sound familiar? And they do it through acts of political violence. This is what Islam looks like when the Crusaders arrive. Islam is not a centralized religion. It is becoming more and more decentralized, and there is no one Islamic political organization that can call upon all followers. So now we have a better understanding and background of the Crusades. You have Islam being threatened by invasion, and you have these big pious movements in Europe. So the First Crusade is sent out in 1095, and it's full of a ton of fanatical religious devotees who believe that the world is going to end soon because they have this strange belief about when Easter is scheduled that we don't really have to get into. But the mastermind behind it is Pope Urban II, and he actually calls the crusade because he wants to encourage people who are rampaging through Europe, aka the Vikings and their children, to rampage around Turkey instead. He calls them not to invade the Holy Land, but to fight against the Seljuk Turks who have just taken over Anatolia. So in that sense, he's merging the Norman Viking violence with the piety that's sweeping through Christianity at the time, and trying to solve the violence in Europe by exporting it to the Islamic world. And this is a movement that lasts centuries. The Crusades do not end in the Middle Ages. They do not end with the Fourth Crusade, which is often the one focused on most, where the Crusaders sack Constantinople. Instead, it continues on and is inspirational for the German expansion into pagan territories like Prussia and Lithuania. It's influential in the Spanish Reconquista, and it's especially influential when we talk about what the Spaniards do in the Americas. So the crusading mindset is inspirational in Europe for centuries.